This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. We've been making cheese in Wisconsin since before we were even a state, which may be one reason why we win so many awards for it. It's what happens when a whole state dreams in cheese. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Hey, welcome to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. I'm Jimmy Carboni. I'm the host. It's our 15th year with Heritage Radio Network. And today we're going to be talking about corn. It's Tuesday, it's October 1st, and it's 2024. So we're going to talk about corn. Everyone loves corn. It's American, whether you're doing barbecue or talking about historical recipes. Corn keeps coming up. Earlier this year, we did a really great Mexican corn whiskey episode with Clay Risen and some friends from Sobre Masa in Brooklyn. And just coming up now, Transmitter, one of our favorite Brooklyn breweries, collaborated with Super Bueno, a great Mexican themed bar with a sweet corn beer. So we're not going to talk about those today, but I did invite two of my favorite grains and cooking and recipe experts in. We're going to talk more about corn itself and recipes and lore and stories about corn. So let's go around the room. You guys introduce yourselves. We'll start with Amy and then Ellie.
Hi, this is Amy Halloran. I'm the flour ambassador, a true grains enthusiast, and I count corn among that. I write and advocate for regional grain systems, and corn is a really important crop within regional grain systems. So thanks for having us on.
Ellie?
Hi, I'm Ellie Markovitch, and I'm a multimedia storyteller, and I'm also a lecturer here at the University of Maine. And I use food as a tool for community building.
So let's go back and talk a little bit about each of your backgrounds with regional grains or, historical grains in the context of corn. So Amy, I'm always a big fan of your pancake recipes, and I've known you probably for 10 years. Where does corn fit into your story? I mean, my story is that probably way back in 2007 or 8 or 9, there was Cayuga Pure Organics coming out of the Finger Lakes. And, being Italian, I use their polenta grind grain, and had a shrimp and grits dish that was out of this world, but it was really based on that corn. So I've been sold on, quality corn for a long time, but I don't quite understand, what's different about the different corns and, the history and heritage and all that. So hopefully we can talk more about that as well as recipes. So Amy, for you, what's your corn story?
Oh yeah, it's corn is huge. I started getting into corn in my 20s, so that's 30 years ago now. I was obsessed with corn pancakes because it was a cake that you could have and it could go sweet or savory. And so I loved making corn pancakes with sweet corn inside them. So cornmeal pancakes with corn. And I started collecting old cookbooklets from baking powder companies and trying to see the difference between corn fritters and corn cakes and what was the thing that's going on and why were there so many recipes for these. And as I got into learning the history of regional grains, I took that pancake love to the next level and the corn curiosity in there too, because I learned that corn is the only grain, meaning member of the grass family, that's native to the Americas. I really, really, really love wheat pancakes, but the first white American settlers couldn't grow wheat very well because they were on coastal New England. And corn, which was the food of the native peoples, the white people adapted corn into their repertoire, and corn and rye became this foundational food for our country. If we sort of think of our staple foods as grain based, the white American sandwich loaf may seem that's how we are growing now, in terms of personally and eating. But our history began back with corn. You eat what grows where you are, and cornmeal rye were the really, really popular, easy to grow, easy to grind grains in New England until the Erie Canal in 1825 began to open up the western part of New York State, which had very different geography. And you could, for the first time in the history of America, start to get more wheat more affordably. The first wheat belts were in western New York State. But up till then and through then, there were these cornbreads, cornmeal, rye, and wheat in a brown bread, which, Jimmy, I'm sure you know the Boston brown bread, those cans of bread that are steamed. They often have raisins in them, lots of molasses. That is a food that represents where we were and what we ate. It's so interesting to see these different markers in food and figure out that it's not static. The foods that we eat are not static. They're always evolving, especially as we migrate and move around. So corn's held a lot of different places in my life, starting in the kitchen and going all the way back to the field and back through history and trying to figure out the human connections to corn.
That's a great intro. And Ellie, tell us about you and corn.
Yeah. So thank you. So I'm originally from Brazil, and corn, it was just a daily bread. We had, some bread, some loaves around the table, but often our breakfast was couscous, which we think of, traditionally a dish from Africa, but our interpretation in the northeast of Brazil, where my family's from. And so we would have couscous for breakfast made out of corn.
Oh, wow.
And so much of, the foods that came out of my childhood was having this grain around us. My grandfather had a small property, and, we would go over the weekends and there was always corn. Brazil, we have corn 3 times a year. That plant is amazing and it just keeps on growing. And so a lot of our daily meals were built around corn. So cakes and broas, lots of desserts. And we would even make homemade meals, almost like a flour out of corn that's fermented. So there are many, many, many recipes growing up. But it was not until, believe it or not, that I moved to Maine that I was able to connect with some farmers from Somali, and they gifted me some seeds. And I was just taken by the opportunity of growing corn in my own backyard. And tasting their corn, I realized that was a corn that I could make so many Brazilian dishes, because we're not talking about sweet corn. We were talking about flint corn. So it was this corn that has all this masa, has all this starch. And so I was just so empowered to just start cooking so many of the recipes I grew up with and growing corn. And then a couple of years ago, I decided I would just live with corn. It was just a little art project that I went on to really think about corn in my life, think about corn in our society, and just to celebrate this amazing grain that has just conquered the world.
Wow. So there's a difference between the sweet corn. So you called it flint corn. I kind of know what masa is. I've never thought about corn having more starch. Tell us more about this. flint corn masa and starch?
So
I'll take this one.
great.
So yeah, there's flint corn. Corn has different types, flint versus dent. So flint corns are very hard and they have glassy kernels, and those would be the style that you would get for your polenta. Um, and then dent corns have an actual indentation or dent in the kernel, and that's how it got its name. This kind of corn can be starchier, and that's generally grown to make masa for tortillas and tamales and cornmeal and grits. And dent corns are also better suited to distillery. Um, and then there's so masa, as long as we're here, let's talk about masa as nixtamalization. This is a process of nixtamalizing or alkalizing corn kernels in lye or wood ash, and that is to soften and remove the outer layers of the kernels. And nixtamalization is responsible for us being able to eat this on a very, very regular basis. Because without this treatment, you can, and if corn is your primary food, you can have what's called pellagra. It's a nutrient problem where you can't absorb nutrients because you haven't treated the corn so that you don't get this niacin deficiency. And also, Jimmy, you do bowl of pozole, you do your pozole fest, right? So hominy is also nixtamalized. It's just whole corn.
Yeah, we
So
get a lot. We get a lot of harmony for those events.
yeah, I bet you do. I bet you do.
Yeah, and in Brazil at that time, thinking about how different societies are thinking about, working with the grain and absorbing the nutrients, there was a lot of fermentation happening around corn in Brazil and different tribes in native communities in Brazil. So not necessarily with ash, but really, soaking the corn and souring the corn. In some accounts where the ash is actually used as well.
Right. And Jimmy, I think can I talk about hybrid corn and GMOs and try to untangle those while we're in there talking about different
Yeah,
kinds?
yeah. I want to understand how corn's different than just what I buy in the supermarket. So.
Yeah, yeah. So corn and soy are the dominant crops grown in America, right? But those varieties are largely GMO, which means that they are types of plants that are grown through non-traditional breeding methods. And they're types that would not be able to grow in the field or in a normal traditional breeding system where they just take one plant parent and another plant parent and cross their pollen. So these GMO foods are one of the reasons that these GMO corn and soy are so dominant in our agricultural system because the yields are so high, and you can also make the plants immune to pests and weeds. It doesn't always last, but you can breed them for that. So corn gets a little bit of a bad name because our eating brain, we don't have a lot of strength, bandwidth to absorb all the information and misinformation that we're getting from the food industry and the way that we're trying to learn about what we put in our mouth, right? GMO corn is largely grown for feeding livestock or for the biofuel industry. So we tend to think, oh, I'm not going to eat corn because of that. Corn is bad. But actually, in regional grain systems, as you discovered with, Cuyahoga Pure Organics, or CPO, which later became the Farmer Ground Flour Mill, that is where a regional grain system can really differentiate the corn it's bringing to the table. corn has so much potential and meaning within people who are trying to do something outside of the dominant agricultural system. Thinking about super small scale, a market gardener, somebody who's selling food at the farmer's market, could do a crop of corn, of a heritage corn, and you can harvest this without a machine. You can have a harvest party and just bring in a whole, 50 or 100 people. You feed them some chili, some pozole, and everybody brings in the corn together in a very non-mechanical way. And then the farmer has a storage crop that they can dry, and it has very different tastes and characteristics than the mass-produced corn that's available through the food channels where we get most of our food. So heritage corns are, there's a lot of great names. You've got Wapsie Valley and Early Riser and Floriani. Then there's super names like Bloody Butcher, which definitely has a place in distilling, and Reed's Yellow. So all of these are not necessarily old and revered in like a super old way, but they are definitely non-GMO, and they are used to create value in terms of actual money, and also the value of a very particular food or beverage flavor contribution, which are super distinct. Have I told this story?
That's a good intro again.
Okay.
And then, Ellie, tell us some more about your handling of the corn that you grew, and then we'll talk about recipes too. If you growing some seeds, and the other day I saw on Instagram that you had, you're harvesting some corn.
Yeah. So yeah, it's it's a very small plot, but it's really a great opportunity to watch the corn grow and learn from it. And Amy and I would like to talk about this all the time. What do we learn from the grains? Like what is the grain teaching us as it adapts? And I always think of, we want to cook things that connect us to a family history, for example, but also we start considering what we can grow and the foods that are available around us. So I cannot make one of the dishes that I absolutely love. It's called pamonha, which is a dish that I make with my family probably twice a year when I'm in Brazil. Again, because you can grow corn multiple times a year. So you get this corn that has, high content starch, and you grind it. And it looks very much like tamale, but it's made with the corn before it dries completely. So it's the same corn, a similar corn, but it's a different stage. So right before it dries completely, you grind this corn and you cook in fresh husks. But otherwise, it's very similar to tamales. Well, I don't, have access to that corn in December, when my family is making this dish in Brazil. So I kind of have adopted the tradition with my little family here in the US, here in Maine, and we make tamales for Christmas. So it's just this connection of, having corn in my life and using this grain that I grew in my backyard. And it's wonderful celebratory aspect.
So how do you grind grain? I mean, how do you grind corn?
Yes, great.
I think of fresh corn. I've seen people dry it, but I don't really know what you do.
Yes. So you could, use a grain mill. I actually have, I have a pestle and mortar that I use to make some recipes, because some of them has to do with fermenting the corn, a particular drink called aluá, which is similar to a corn kvass, if you will. And so for that corn, the corn just needs to be lightly cracked. So I do that by hand. I do have a hand mill that I got secondhand. It's a really good deal. And you can use that. Or you could also use some of the, table meals that people use. If your corn has been soaked and is wet, you could use something as simple as a blender. Your just household, a little bit probably powerful blender would do better. But, your home kitchen blender could work. So there are many ways of grinding your corn depending on the application. In Brazil, one of my favorite dishes, and I make at least once a week in our house, is a blender cake. Basically put your cornmeal in a blender and with some milk, and it's called the 5 cups. I guess I'm just already jumping the recipe here. I can't help myself, Jimmy. So it's the 5 cups. And so you just hand grind some cornmeal. It doesn't have to be super fine. You put in a blender with liquid. So it's 5 cups, a cup of milk, a cup of eggs, a cup of oil, a cup of sugar, a cup of corn. And you grind all that up in your blender. And then, as my mother would say, as long as you have a tablespoon of baking powder, there you go, you have a cake. Put a tablespoon of baking powder, pinch of salt, and bake it, and you have a cake. So very simple recipes, but really very part of my, growing up. And it's amazing to grow this corn in my backyard. And we have tried to do now the 3 Sisters method. And we found really great success because, everybody wants to eat the corn growing in your backyard.
Tell our listeners what the 3 Sisters method is.
Yeah, so the 3 Sisters, your squash and your beans. So I grow the squash in the bottom, and the beans will climb the corn. And this is, ancient practice that I just, learned from a lot of different Native communities that have embraced that. And I think it makes sense. And what I noticed in my own backyard is that it helps with the creatures. The squash leaves are very prickly, so it really keeps, mice and anybody in the field from climbing up. Not that they won't find their way, they will, but it really helps.
And then do you have a recipe for all 3, the squash, beans, and corn, that you like to make?
Yeah, so I have several recipes. I really enjoy cooking the whole entire squash. So everything in the squash is completely edible. So I like to use the leaves as, quote, my parchment paper. So you could make a muffin. So in your liquid, in your recipe, you can just grind up your squash, the seeds, the whole, just cook the whole thing. Your seeds, your squash, but in a crock pot, cook the whole thing, grind it all up. You have this puree, very nutritious. You can use that in your cake making, for example, or in your bread. And then you use your squash leaves as your parchment paper. It's such a beautiful, reunion of all the flavors and how they grow together.
And when Ellie says use it as your parchment paper, also picture it on, her beautiful loaves of sourdough bread. She'll line the pan with them, and it'll be cooked in a squash leaf sometimes. And when she says grind up everything, I want to emphasize that this is an incredible taste and nutrition packed, as well as being able to use really big squash. Sometimes you'll see these heirloom squashes, and they're huge, right? They have these giant shoulders. Yeah. They're bigger than your head. You don't want to cut those. They're gonna hurt you and send you to the hospital. You shove the whole thing in the oven. You shove the entire thing in the oven on a tray, cook it till it's soft, and then you grind it in a blender or a food processor. That's just all of it. So you want to wash it before you put it in the oven. But it's an incredible way to utilize all of the elements of this food. I want to point out that squash, when its plant origins were bred in the Middle East, they were going for the seeds first. They knew that the protein and the oils were really important. So the flesh is secondary. Isn't that crazy? This pumpkin, if we're going to glorify pumpkin and pumpkin spice, go back to the whole food and use it.
And also think about, the summer squash in some countries and some cultures grew for the leaves. And we just totally think it's nonsense. We never would eat that, right? But you
Tell
could
me
just,
more. I love this. And squash gets a bad rap too, whether it's zucchini or squash.
yeah.
I think it's a great vegetable.
And I think just if you think about all of them coming together in one delicious stew, and thinking about your beans that are going to dry, and then you're going to save also the seeds, and how these foods are going to carry you through the winter. I grow a squash called Queen of Smyrna.
Smyrna, yep.
Smyrna, and it's incredible. It will go from harvest time into like July. It just keeps forever. And so it's a squash, it's a food that can be in our plates throughout the winter. And so you have your beans, you have your protein, you have the oils from your seeds, you have the delicious flesh from the squash. So you really, and then you have your corn, your starch, your how are very energetic, caloric foods. So that can carry you through a Maine winter right there.
It's amazing what you can do with simple food. So, having moved to Maine, how has Maine influenced your corn recipes and appreciation for corn? And also the history of there just seems to be so many great traditional grains that are in Maine.
Ellie, let's talk a little bit more about the Somali Bantu that you got your corn from. So this is a Liberation Farms is a Somali Bantu community association, and these are people who came from Somalia and settled in Lewiston, Maine, and they are growing the corn that feeds them. Right. So here is this completely displaced community that's making new food routes as they rebuild their lives here. And Ellie, how did you connect with them and be lucky enough to get some of this corn to steward in your life?
Yeah, so we met through the Maine Grain Alliance, and I was doing some photographs. And at the end, there was, this table, and it had the corn, and it has a little bit, like one little piece of husk. And so they explained to us in a tour that that's how they would communicate with each farmer, which ones were for saving the seeds. So they had the corn they were eating, and then this, whole corn that they would save. They identify as the seeds being really good quality seeds as a corn to save. So as he was telling this, I was telling him, I said, I long for, corn that I could make, foods from Brazil. And this corn looks very similar. And so on my way out, they came to me and said, well, would you like to take this home with you? I was just, it was the best gift ever. And so I brought it home, and the next year I planted that. And then just really connecting, my family recipes to that corn, but also really deep appreciation for, this grain that means so much to so many cultures. Like here you are, grain of Americas that travel to Africa, probably through the Portuguese, perhaps, or maybe, I'm thinking some of these recipes that I identified that I find in Africa cuisine that actually came from interpretations of the connections between the Portuguese people in Brazil, but also, probably also seeds that, went to Spain and maybe went to Africa. So these seeds end up in Africa, and then here they are coming back to America as this most prized, cultural gift and sustenance, right, for a people. And so they make a bread called mufu, which I haven't had, but it's really very similar to, just a simple like tortilla, if you will. It's just the idea of like a simple bread that, corn that gets mixed, sometimes mixed with wheat, but really corn that gets mixed with water, sometimes with an egg, and makes this bread.
Wow. That's really terrific. And I'm going to jump to you guys sent me a few things. I have a bag here. Well, first I want to ask you about processing corn more. So if my friends at Transmitter made a Mexican-inspired beer with sweet corn, do you have any idea what type of corn they would have used in brewing, and what would they have done first to the corn? Would they have milled it? What would they have done with corn to brew with it? If you don't know, it's okay, but I have a feeling you might know.
I feel kind of stumped about sweet corn because that's so different. Those varieties are grown not for storage; they're for fresh eating, right? So it's different. I would think that they would cook the kernels, cook them on the cob and then cut it off. But then maybe I would guess they would use the kernels too. I mean, the cobs too, because home cooks do this as well. When I'm making a corn, I can't remember the name of it, but if I'm using the fresh corn to make corn cakes or a corn souffle, corn, that the name is jumping away from me. Anyway, you scrape the milk out of the cob. So you want all of it. You want to get all of it. And I would bet with the brewing, they were going for the all of it kind of thing as
Yeah.
well, to get all the sugars and all the flavors out of it.
So
That's what I'm thinking.
in Brazil, we make different kinds of things from corn. I think one of the things that I think when I think of sweet corn, I think of the food for the Wild East. So the same way we would use apples, they're very sweet, for example, or you think of grapes. So perhaps they're using the corn as this fruit, like a very fruity, very sweet food for your Wild East.
And help the fermentation.
For fermentation.
Yeah.
Now, I do make this drink called alua, which is from the dry corn, where you crack the corn and then you soak for 10 days or so with some raw sugar. And from that, you would get the fermentation process. Then you can go to a second fermentation. You can flavor the second fermentation and you can bottle. And then, of course, in 4 or 5 days, you have the beginning of a beer type of low alcohol content. And then if you let it stay open, eventually get some vinegar.
This stuff, Jimmy, you would love. Jimmy, Ellie came back to Troy because Ellie lived here in Troy in upstate New York for 8 years, and she started something called Story Harvest, which is an incredible community festival of food at the Sanctuary for Independent Media near us, which is also great community radio. Go community radio. And so the dishes that Ellie made for Story Harvest last year included the alua or corn kvass, and we served that in a big delicious. It was a cold day, so we actually ended up serving it a little warm. Another dish that we made really explored we learned about corn's hopscotching capacity. Ellie makes this cake that comes out in 3 layers or a bar, and it's milk, eggs, sugar, and corn. And the corn meal goes to the bottom, and then there's this pudding layer, and then there's more corn on the top, and then another little bit floats on the top. It's this beautiful pudding-like cake, and Ellie makes it very Brazilian. And I have a friend from Romania who makes the same thing with no sugar in it. And it's more like her family's version of polenta. So there's corn and eggs and milk. And it blew my mind to see how, as I would say it, people discovered these things all the time. And as Ellie would say it, the corn expressed itself in similar ways to everyone. And this isn't, a unique dish. This happens all over the place. Polenta is grits, is mufu, is the other the corn cereal that you sent, Ellie, to me. I shared a little with Jimmy, and I can't remember the name of it that you have.
Oh, I want to ask you. Yeah, it says Brazilian corn flour farina de milho, and it looks like
Yes.
little crispy cornflakes.
Yes. So this one that is a fermented flour, and the process is very similar. So you kind of pound your corn a little bit. You can use some ashes to try to remove the skin, so you get to the grits. So you remove the germ. Then you get this corn and you grind it, and then after you grind it, you sift the very fine parts into this biscuit-like corn flake bits of it. And this is one way of increasing the nutritional value of the corn by fermenting it, then making it so now you have a product that's ready to be eaten. And in Brazil, we eat as it's an accompaniment for like dishes with a broth. Like if you had a chicken broth or a soup, you would sprinkle that in. You would eat that with milk as a cereal. You would eat that with some molasses and banana and cheese, for example, as an afternoon snack.
So I could put it in if I have a good yogurt. I could put some in the yogurt.
Yes, absolutely. You can sprinkle that in the yogurt. It's absolutely delicious on top of your collard greens or your black beans. So it's a product.
How do you ferment it? I mean,
so you ferment it by exactly. You just add water to it and let it natural fermentation take place, and you would see the bubbles come up after 3 days, and it can go up to 10 days. And then right after that, you would grind it and you're going to sift it. And as a matter of fact, I'm doing a food demonstration here on October 6th in Maine for the fermentation fair, where we're going to make this together.
Wow.
Little plug here.
And then let's go back with one more. Okay, the fermented corn beer. Since I don't know how Transmitter made their beer, walk us through that step. And I want to make sure you should post your recipe for this one. So fermented corn beer by Ellie Markovitch.
Yes. So this is alua. So for the alua, you would get your corn, your dry corn. You could probably play with any kind of dry corn you can find from your co-op, for example. You would put in a pan, a little bit like in a cast iron, for example, and you kind of slightly roast that until you see some golden marks on your corn. It starts to release some oils and some smells. Then you let it cool. Then you crack a little bit. You put in a vessel of your choice.
Ellie, how do you suggest people crack it? In a mortar and pestle, in a blender?
Mortar and pestle, or you can run your blender for a couple pulses. You don't want it to become a flour.
Okay.
You just want it to just crack enough to make that starch and the sugars, everything available for the wild yeast.
Gotcha.
Then you can add a couple teaspoons of sugar if you want, but you don't have to. You could also add a little bit of ginger. Again, people in different cultures, but some of the tribes in Brazil later on started adding some sweetness to it. But many recipes that I read, it's just the corn. It has enough sugar in it, and you cover that with water. And what I like to do, Jimmy, is just go there and stir that up every day, just to kind of keep things moving. And I keep it covered with a cheesecloth, to keep bugs from coming in and messing things up. And after 10 days, I would strain that. That liquid is the beginning, right? You have this fermented liquid. You put in your airtight container where you can build up your carbonization. And at that moment, you want to feed your wild yeast a little bit more sugar. So I would put in a couple teaspoons of sugar in there. And your flavor, you could put some clove, you could put a little bit of ginger, whatever flavor you would like on your beer, or just straight corn. And believe it or not, it's a very similar process of making tapash, which is how many, many, many cultures, including Amazon, would have fermented their pineapple to also make this really delighted fermented drink. So it's a very similar process of making tapash.
Yeah,
And then
we've
you
had
build your
we've had tapache too. Yes.
yeah, and you have that carbonization, and it will continue fermenting. If you keep it locked, just burp that jar a couple of times. If you have an airlock, it will continue fermenting, and you could flavor that, and it's really, really a nice treat.
Wow. So our listeners out there, the home brewers, let's give it a shot, because I know Mary Izett probably had something like that in one of her homebrew books from a few years ago. So that's really exciting. I'm going to take a short break. We'll be back in a minute on Beer Sessions Radio. All right.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. There's a reason when you think of Wisconsin, you think cheese. Cheese is a huge part of Wisconsin's history and future. In Wisconsin, the state of cheese, the tradition of cheese-making excellence began 180 years ago, before Wisconsin was recognized as a state. Immigrants traveled to settle in this lush green hills of Wisconsin, bringing their cheese-making traditions with them. These storied skills, combined with the freshest milk available, created a cheese-making culture that is uniquely Wisconsin. Wisconsin's 1,200 cheesemakers, many of whom are third and fourth generation, continue to pass on old world traditions while adopting modern innovations in cheese-making craftsmanship. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
Hey, welcome back to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. I'm Jimmy Carboni. Thanks for supporting us for 15 years on heritageradionetwork.org. So we're talking about corn with Amy and Ellie. So for you guys, we talked a little about some recipes. We talked about fermenting corn beer. Some favorite recipes for both of you. Amy, you sent me some corn and rye mix. What is the magic of this brown bread and these other traditional corn and rye flours? Because I grew up with New England brown bread and I love it. It's one of my favorite breads.
The magic for me is that it tells history. I started looking in older cookbooks, and I've had some mentors guiding me through this corn curiosity. One of them is a woman named Paula Marcoux, who's an oven specialist in near Plymouth, Massachusetts, and she has a cookbook. I can't remember the name of it, but she really taught me how this cornbread can tell the story of the footprint that we have here on the land. So at first, it was just cornmeal rye, and cornmeal rye with just a native wild yeast coming in, and then you'd cook it on the hearth. Here we're talking like late 1600s, early 1700s. That's what you've got. As corn, as wheat and baking powder became more available. First there was something called saleratus, which was a primitive style of leavening. It's very powerful stuff, lent a lot of flavor, not really good flavor to baked goods, but it was something that would help keep, I'm making a springing action with my fingers because I want to show you that it's to help it spring up in the pan. So they would have added saleratus to the cornmeal rye, and richer people would have made a thirded bread. So that's made with a third cornmeal, a third rye, and a third wheat, or on very special days. You could get, initially we would import wheat from England, of all places, when we weren't growing enough here in But then as more ingredients became more available through more intensive forms of agriculture, you're getting toward the 1800s, then it emerged into this brown bread. And brown bread really tells all of our baking history because well, it was called brown bread before that, but if it's in the can, then you're getting to cast iron cook stoves and the evolution of, from hearth cooking to outdoor ovens to these cast iron cook stoves. Cast iron cook stoves didn't have great ovens. The heat was all over the place. You'd have one corner burnt and the rest of it's just batter. So, but they boiled really well. And also at the same time, you're getting manufacturing of different foods. So you'd get maybe your lard in a can, and you could steam a brown bread in a lard can. And that is cornmeal, rye, buttermilk. You're using up soured milk, maybe no eggs, molasses, and then it's cooking on top of the stove. And right there, you have this layer cake of history of our interactions with staple foods. So I love that about it. But then the corn pancakes, and I mean, that's why I love any kind of cornmeal rye, is that in my head, I'm going through that history. I'm not just in this moment, I'm in all of these moments of largely women contacting food and nourishing people to go forward. And then in my own life, I really love pancakes because I love a griddle. They were one of the first things I learned to cook. My father surrendered the Saturday pancakes to me, and as I grew up and fell in love with these cornmeal pancakes, it became a real staple in my family, and especially cornmeal rye pancakes, because you can just have those and you feel like you've cooked all day, but dinner's ready in 10 minutes. You have the cornmeal rye mix ready. You saute up whatever vegetables you've got that happen to be around. Maybe you've got some greens, maybe it's just onions and peppers that day. Hopefully you've got some beans. You can have beans on the side, a little yogurt, and you've got a full dinner. And the house smells great because you've cooked them on the griddle. So all the delicious odors are right there coming off of the top of the stove. You can take them camping. And I've taken them camping before, bring the griddle. Just today, I was in a thrift store in central New York and I got a new aluminum griddle. And I'm so excited to have another cast aluminum griddle, which are really great for making pancakes on.
I do,
So,
I do, I do love your pancakes. And one thing I learned not too long ago was I tried to incorporate, more ancient grain flours into my cooking. My first go-to is always try them out in the pancake, thanks to Amy Halloran.
totally.
Yeah. And that,
In a
wait, back to
pancake,
Ellie. And pancakes are the best.
they are. They don't have to rise up. You don't have to get some gluten structure developing like that. You want a leavened bread. They're talk about ancient food. Probably the first cooked bread was a pancake on a hot rock, just some kind of gruel cooked on a hot rock. And there you've got a pancake. But I've gone on long enough. Ellie.
Well, I just want to say that I almost neglect to mention that for me, corn is an invitation to really connect with the land. And there is a beautiful poem, Jimmy, that I would love to share with you later. It's a translation by a Brazilian poet from the state where I'm from in Brazil, from Goiás. And she talks about this grain that is just everybody's grain, and it grows in the corners of your land. It's not fancy, it's not wheat, but you can process it at home. And that is what corn is for me. It's the daily bread. It is the grain that it's not fancy. You can soak it and you can grind, you can make a mush and you feed your family. And I think ultimately that is the main appeal. I grew up, watching my family processing corn, and it's just so simple, but it feeds you through the seasons. And even in the winter of Maine, when it's all you have is like dry grain, if one were to only have dry grain, we're so spoiled. Of course, we have a lot more options. But if we think in those terms, this is a grain that you can process at home. I love wheat. Don't get me wrong. I love rye. So many of these grains, it require tremendous effort. But corn invites us. We can just have it in our pantries, and it's also nutritious. So that is the one thing that I felt like I needed to say before we go.
Oh, this poem, Jimmy, is beautiful. It was written by a woman named Coralina, and it's a corn prayer. And we made a poster of it, and I think I still have copies, and I will send you a copy of it because it's a beautiful sentiment about food and our relationship to it, but especially corn.
One of all my grandfathers are from Italy, but my one grandfather was, born on a small farm in southern Italy, and we always grew up having corn polenta with him. That's what we ate. He didn't grow up with pasta, and I didn't think about that until right now as we're talking. And I've loved incorporating polenta into my cooking for so many years that it does tie me to my family. So I love that. But about the growing, last thing. So another reason I wanted to do the show is this summer I got to visit our friend Andrea Stanley at her new the Valley Malt moved to Holyoke, Mass, to a nice milling and malt facility. And I had asked Andrea this question. I said, Andrea, if I were a small farmer who wanted to start out growing a type of grain that could be used for malting, for the alcohol business, what should I start with? And she said to start with corn. And I love that. So I've been thinking corn on the brain since then. So
Yeah.
Again, Amy, which type of corn would be good for a small farmer to grow, like if they want to process for distilling?
Oh, it really depends on where you are. It goes area to area. All of these seeds in a regional system are super specific. So if people are interested, I'd encourage them to get in touch with another corn farmer nearby, or another, grain grower nearby, or cooperative extension are super helpful, or a mill or a malt house that is going to be doing this. Just reach out to them. As you know, Jimmy, people are so friendly in the grain world, and go find your local grain people and get conversations going. That's what I'd say.
Thank you. And Ellie, for Maine, I've been to Portland a couple of times. I know maltsters up there. I know farmers who are growing, barley type grains for beer and whiskeys. Are there some other farmers that growing different types of grains besides your friends from Somalia?
So Rusted Rooster is actually a farm that Amy was just here, and we visit. They're growing corn, and I am not sure if he's selling for anybody making beer right now, but I know he is supplying the corn for a local tortilleria. So they're, for tortillas, local tortillas. And so there is a lot of energy around corn. I think a lot of us, have a memory around corn. It's interesting, right? Like if you think about it, it could be cornbread, maybe, corn pancakes, or maybe it's just corn on a cob. We love corn in this country, in many countries. It's the largest grown grain all over the world. We love corn. So there's many connections. And I think understanding, that you have this other corn, that it's this grain that you can incorporate on your diet, it's really powerful. And people can make drinks at home, and they can make homemade vinegar. So it's a powerhouse of ideas.
That's amazing. I want to give a big shout out to my friends Arik Torn and Cameron, who are importing the Maize Nation now. They'll be in New York with us later this month for Bolazol. It's really exciting to get some high-quality Mexican corn whiskeys coming into the state, and I'm looking forward to trying a lot more, definitely corn-based beverages as well. But thank you guys so much for joining me. I really just wanted to get a little intro to corn, and Amy, you're one of my favorite grains people, and right away you said, got to invite Ellie. So thank you so much. Any final words for me? And what's story cooking?
Yeah, story cooking is just my personal brand. I just realized, after over a decade as a photojournalist, if I was not picking up my camera, what else would I be doing? And I love eating with people and talking about food. And so that was how story cooking was born. So I'm still going strong, sitting around with friends, even if it is over the internet, just like we are right now, and talking about food and making media and hopefully helping connect each other.
Thanks, Ellie.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to encourage people to find your food best friend, because that's what Ellie is for me, and she encourages me to grow and think about food in whole new ways. I remember Ellie took pictures for me for my book for the new bread basket, and the questions she asked me. I write about food. I think about food all the time, but when you have a friend who can push your brain sideways and help you think more, there's nothing better than that. So Ellie is an ad for friendship, and I hope we all have such good friends.
Well, that's great. Last thing, special corn moment. If you're ever in the East Village on East 4th Street, look up Factory Tamal. It's a startup business. They've been doing it for a few years now, and they're making traditional tamales, and they're cooked with lard. And when I'm in the neighborhood, I'll have 3 for lunch. So thank you to Factory Tamal on East 4th Street. Ellie and Amy, thanks so much for joining me. Thanks for this intro. Thanks for sharing your fermented corn beer recipe, which hopefully you'll post and our listeners can follow you. And big shout out to Armin Spengen, our engineer. Armin, it's always great working with you. And congrats to Heritage Radio Network, 15 years. We'll catch you next time on Beer Sessions Radio. Thanks so much. Beer Sessions Radio is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network. Food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.